Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's very good to see you here. Thank you very much for coming. It's not the first time we've met, but I thought for perhaps, Jacob, if we just introduce ourselves, because I don't think you've met us before. I'm Julia Cumberledge, and I've been asked to chair this review. On my right is Simon Whale, and he's been very involved in the communications, and he's a communications expert, and it's been very helpful. And Sir Cyril Chandler is my vice chairman, so we are the three members of the panel. We're very ably supported by our secretary, Dr. Valerie Barras, who's on my right over there, and also Sonia MacLeod, Dr. MacLeod, who's our senior researcher. And then other people in the room are here just to support the session, as it were. So, Yasmin, thank you so much for coming and bringing your colleagues with you. And I really want to say how much I think you've achieved as an all-party group. And I think without all the PQs, without all the debates and everything that you've put forward in Parliament, this subject would not have the high profile it does now, and indeed I think would not have been included in the review, but it was seen to be a very important area that in the past has been neglected to some extent, despite all the efforts that you and your colleagues have made. So I know it's not just the parliamentarians you've worked with, but it's also working with the patient group. And I would like to pay a tribute to Mary Lyon and to her husband, indeed, Mike, who's come here. And together they have researched so much of this area, and both nationally and internationally, and of course have spoken in Parliament and had sessions there as well. And all the questions that they've raised that has affected families, we've heard those, and that's been really, really helpful to us. And of course the evidence that they've given, both in writing and verbally. But Mary Lyon and her husband here today are observers, though I'm sure she'll be itching to talk, but I'm afraid this time, no. And Jason Farrell, very good to see you here also as an observer. Thank you very much. So just to set it in briefly in some context, as you're very well aware, we've been travelling the country, we've been talking to a lot of individuals, we've heard a huge amount from families who've been affected by HTPs, and we're now nearing the end of our oral evidence. It's not complete because we want to finish by listening to the patient groups again. We're going to invite them back again. All our sessions have been screened. They're on the website, so people have been watching that, and we intend to do that today, and I hope that's all right with you. Great. So just to stress that patients have really been the heart of our review. And I want to take this opportunity to pay a tribute to the courage, to the physical and mental suffering that we've heard, the impact, particularly Primodos, that has had on families, the guilt that mothers have felt in connection with this medication, unwarranted guilt, but nevertheless they feel it and they have told us about it. And then it's been about the struggling to getting through life and also the worries about the future, and they are very real indeed. So we've heard a lot of heartbreaking stories, but I have to say we've been really struck by the courage and dignity of those that we've met. So to go to this hearing, it's really an opportunity for you to tell us what you think as an all-party parliamentary group, things that you think we really have missed that we need to know, and things that we should focus upon, particularly on the future, because clearly that's been part of the statement that Jeremy Hunt made when he set up the review, to look to the future. And of course you can raise anything else that you wish to comment on the evidence that you yourselves have received. So, as I've said, we are recording this session. So it would be very helpful on that basis if I could ask you to introduce yourselves so that people watching on the website will know who you are and why you're here. If there happens to be a vote in the Commons, then of course we would expect you to go and on the vote, and we hope you'd come back as well after that. So is that all right? Is that all clear? Okay, so Yasmin, if you'd like to start by introducing yourself, and perhaps your colleagues would like to introduce themselves, or you may want to do it.
Well, thank you. I'm Yasmin Qureshi, Member of Parliament for Bolton South East and Shadow Justice Minister and Chair of the All-Parliamentary Group on Hormone Pregnancy Test. Can I just say, on behalf of the All-Parliamentary Group, to thank you, Baroness Cumberland, and so Cyril and your team for all the work that you've been doing on this review and the considerable undertaking that you have taken. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm proposing to go into three aspects of the whole inquiry, and my colleagues will deal with some other aspects of it. We'll try not to repeat ourselves. Although I know that inevitably some of what I may say today is probably repetition, but it's just important to set the scene. By way of background, the APPG was set up in 2014. Prior to that, Marie Lyon and I, for some time, were knocking on the door of governments, but really not being heard. Indeed, we sent several letters and questions, and as you have mentioned earlier in your introduction, questions, letters to different ministers, we basically were getting no response. Eventually, we did have one health minister at the time, Daniel Poulter, who agreed to meet us, and he then asked MHRA to set up a short review into whether there was any link between PIMIDOS and deformities. And as you probably know, that review found there was not. However, we did not accept that because clearly from the documents that we have seen, from the information we have, that we felt that conclusion was completely wrong. And therefore we continued, relying on my office, and we have now an APPG which has 135 members of Parliament on it. And I'm proud to say I think one of the largest and most active of these all-parliamentary group. And I'm really grateful for all my parliamentary colleagues, not the ones here today, and others, because this is one of those groups where the MPs actually take an active, conscious role and participate in whether there's urgent questions or debates. And as you know yourself, when you came to one of our meetings, how packed the room was, the committee room was, and you know the amount of passion and feeling in this case. And it's not sort of and it's not party political. This is above anything to do with politics or, you know, any particular government, because we feel that there has been a failure for many, many years across the board. And I think the reason the members of Parliament are so concerned and are passionate about this is because we want answers on behalf of our constituents. And this is very much constituent-led. And I think the first part of it is the historical evidence. You know, there have been countless official documents and letters exchanged between government officials, doctors and the scientists. And I know you probably have seen some, or maybe will be seeing some. And what they show is that the gynecologists, the pediatrics, the medical profession, people were raising the fact that this PIMIDOS could affect the fetus or cause children to abort. And some of these files, however, were classified until 2010 and only came to light a few years ago. And let me begin by one specific example. So in 1967, the then Committee on Safety of Medicine was contacted by a paediatrician at Queen Mary's Hospital in London, Dr. Isabel Gale, who I'm sure you've heard about her, who said that there was a link between the hormone pregnancy tests such as PIMIDOS and spinal congenital malformations in newborns. The Minister of State at the time said she has produced a prima facie evidence that fetal abnormalities might be associated with the use of hormonal pregnancy testing. And then that same year, there's a letter from the Medical Research Council which states, it looks like, in fact, that this could be another thalidomide story. And the Royal College of General Practitioners then produced figures for, sharing the pharmaceuticals, showing the high rate of miscarriages, stillbirths, infant deaths, and abnormalities of babies whose mothers had taken the hormone pregnancy test. And in fact, the report's author, Mr. Dean, concluded, and I know you've heard from Jason in his evidence session where he's touched upon Mr. Dean's evidence, and he actually concluded that the drug should be withdrawn. And I like to emphasize that the drug should be withdrawn. And in 1968, the Royal College of General Practitioners sent a letter to Dr. Inman, who was the chair of the Committee on Safety of Medicine, the regulatory bodies at the time, stating that 10% of abortions recorded after primidose were unlikely to be due to a chance. And same year, Shearing lead UK scientists wrote to their parent company in Berlin stating, it is extremely disturbing that the results of statistics, human studies and other studies all point clearly to the possibility that primidose may interfere with pregnancy. Despite this, despite knowing all of this, the drug still remained on the market. So we want to know why. Why on earth was such a drug kept on the market? Given the gravity of the severe congenital abnormalities, the drug should have been immediately suspended, pending a full clearance by the committee. Because, unlike some drugs like sodium valproate, which you're quite looking at, they actually have a medicinal purpose. But this has no medicinal or therapeutic purpose. So it could have been quite easily withdrawn from the market. And the fact that it wasn't, in my opinion, and I think my parliamentary colleague was, a complete and utter moral dereliction of duty, and not just moral dereliction, actually legal duty as well. Because I know people say, well, things were different in those days and it may not happen again, but I'm sure the legal obligation and the moral obligation to protect patients would have been there just as much paramount as it is now. So why? 1.5 million pregnant women have been placed at unnecessary risk by being prescribed these drugs. Thousands of children were damaged, suffering from dreadful disabilities. Many have brain damage, some have spina bifida, others have heart and limb defects, cleft palate, deafness and other horrible disabilities. They don't need to have had those. This could have all have been stopped. And instead of taking action, the government did nothing. Nothing at all. Even though the evidence that Dr. Gale presented, which was dismissed by the Committee on Safety of Medicine. And in a very interesting letter to his colleagues, Dr. Inman actually said, I have had an exhausting meeting with Dr. Isabel Gale. She believes she should have had more funding for her research and that a larger number of abnormal babies may have been born in the time that has elapsed. And he said, we are defenseless in the matter of the 8 years delay. And I know you're aware of the fact that it took 8 years before the actual product came off, the primidose came off the market. And he goes on to say that Dr. Gale is an intelligent, dedicated, but rather sad little person. I dealt with her sympathetically, but I do not believe we have heard the last of this matter. And can I say on this, he's absolutely right, because this isn't the last of this matter. We are going to determine to ensure that we get to the bottom of this and get justice for the victims of the drug primidose. On the issue of sharing and bearer's role, you heard from Jason, who, as you know, has also been investigating this matter. And he gave in his evidence that in the 70s, the primidose lost its license for use as a pregnancy test drug. But the Committee on Medicine, the regulatory body, failed to warn the doctors until 1975. And then in a letter it suggested that it may cause congenital abnormalities. And in 1977, it actually stated that association has been confirmed. And Bayer confirmed to Sky News that the drugs had not been licensed as pregnancy tests after 1970, and that anyone using it would have been doing so off-label. So again, there are serious questions. Why? Why were they still being given to women who they thought there might be pregnancy, even though the non-invasive, cheap urine test was available? Despite that, it was being given. And it wasn't until 1975, as you probably were aware, that the label on the packet said, not to be taken during pregnancy. A possibility exists of an association between the use of primidors during early pregnancy and an increased incidence of congenital abnormalities. Because of this possible hazard, primidors must not be taken unless it is certain that the patient is not pregnant. But, again, nothing happened. And in 1967, since 1967, in fact, I think there's evidence that shows since the mid-50s, the medical community have been aware of the fact that there were potential problems with this drug. All these years, nothing done again. And the Committee on Safety of Medicine didn't even bother to inform the doctors that actually primidors could no longer be used as a pregnancy test. So, yet doctors continue to prescribe this drug even after 1975. That is evidence of malpractice at a very large scale. Coming on to the expert working group, after a full debate in the big chamber, the minister in 2015, George Freeman, set up an expert working group, and he agreed in the discussions we had with him and on the floor of the House that this would be an independent review and that all the evidence would be released and reviewed. And this is really important, all the evidence being reviewed. And we mentioned to him about a document which has shown the cover-up. Because if I may go back, when I first became involved in this case through my constituents, I went to our home, I met, and there were boxes of papers. And I actually went through quite a lot of those documents. And this is when I was reading those papers that I thought to myself, there is, in my opinion, and I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but looking at the document, one thing was very clear: there's been a complete cover-up here. People know what's going on, and they've done nothing. And we were very anxious for that information to be given to the expert working group. We were anxious that the evidence that was covered by Sky should have been before then. We were anxious that the evidence that Murray had discovered from the Kew archives should have been before then. But we turn out that actually EWG were never looked at these documents. And as I understand, and I hope you correct me, that the MHRA was the person who was controlling what they were supposed to look at. Now, to me, that is fundamentally wrong, because if you're setting up an inquiry, you can't have another body saying, hey, you're a group of experts, you look at this information, but hang on, you're not going to look at 20,000 other documents. How are they going to arrive at any conclusion, real proper inquiry without sight of those documents? We expect, as a matter of course, that the people sitting on the EWG, as well as the MHRA, are independent people. People who, if they have any interest in the medical, or have been sponsored or financed or worked for pharmaceutical companies, that they would be declaring that, and in fact automatically almost perhaps rule themselves out. But the chair of the expert working group told us that they had a system of self-declaration, so people could declare if they wanted to, but if they didn't want to. And it was Marie's research which led to at least one panel member being taken off the expert working group. And when we find out how MHRA is funded by Big Pharma, and then it only gives part of the evidence and papers to the EW expert working group, then we are bothered. We are concerned because we don't believe that that was therefore A, an independent inquiry, and B, and this is really important, that most of the substantial evidence papers we wanted them to have looked at, they never looked at it. And again, we've had no real proper explanation given as to why that sifting was taking place. Why pick and choose when that wasn't the purpose of it? Because otherwise, it's almost, and I've said this in Parliament, and I believe that the EWG's work is really not worth the piece of paper it's written on, because it's not comprehensive. It didn't look at all the documents. Had it looked at the boxes, thousands of documents, and every piece of paper available, I don't think they would have come to the conclusion they have. Then, of course, we have the issue about how this evidence has been assessed by the review team. And here I'm guided very much by, what Professor Carl Hennigan set out, because obviously he's the expert in these matters. And I have a lot of faith and respect in him because he's an academic, he's an independent. His funding doesn't come from pharmaceutical companies, as I'm aware. And one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And he sets out very clearly in his evidence session, and so I don't want to repeat myself, about how he thinks the methodology should have been, what the correct methodology should be, the meta-analyses, the way the analogies are current. And it appears that none of those methods was followed in this expert working group. And then there's the issue of transparency. Why was it cloaked in so much secrecy? Marie Lyon, who in the end they agreed to be able to sit into this inquiry as an observer, was not allowed to discuss her concerns with us, because she'd been made to sign a gagging clause which said that if she said anything, she could end up going to prison. And when the Member of Parliament for Livingston, Hannah Badal, and I tried to attend the press conference for the launch of the Ruiz report, we were locked out and told we couldn't enter. Two members of Parliament represent their constituents being told you're not welcome. What's everybody's got to hide? And then, as we said, we have clear concerns about the finding of the APPG. We do believe it's a whitewash. It should have been peer-reviewed. I understand that, there is normally an industry-wide expectation that some kind of peer review would be done. Not here. In fact, the only body that was going to carry out the peer review was the MHRA. Well, MHRA could hardly be considered to be an independent peer review body, because they're the ones who set up the EWG. They're the ones that told them what they can even look at. It's like themselves policing each other. So I know my colleagues will go into more of some other aspects of this. I just want to sort of effectively conclude by saying that, as I said, I got involved in it because of my constituents, just as my other parliamentary colleagues, and because of the documents I read. And the way, the ladies who took the drug, the way they were treated, the methodology, the content of the drugs, and the fact, and I know my other colleague Jacob's going to go a bit more into this, about the fact that it seemed that this primidose was being used in parts of the world to abort. And it seemed the pharmaceutical companies knew that as well. And the medical community didn't even know that as well. And yet, despite that, they carried on. So, I am completely, and I know that I'm trying not to be subjective here. Before I became Member of Parliament, I practiced as a barrister for many years. I do believe in something called evidence. I do believe in, causations and all those aspects of it. Looking at it, looking at what Professor Hennigan has found, what Professor Abraham has said, what Dr. Vargason has said, what happened to the ladies, what's the constituent component of this, and also the fact that this drug had been used in many parts of the country to abort, leaves me that beyond any reasonable doubt that the drug A, caused the harm, and B, medical communities knew exactly what was happening, and C, there was a complete cover-up. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. A very thorough exposition of the history and also your concerns, which I think are extremely valuable. You may want to go into some of those a bit later on. But do one of your colleagues want to come in?
Okay, my name's Davey. I'm here as a constituency MP for Kingston Surbiton. And can I first of all thank you for allowing us to give evidence, and also thank you for the way you've been conducting your inquiry. This issue was brought to my attention by a constituent who had a child many years ago who has many disabilities, lifelong disabilities, as a result, we believe, of having taken Primados. That's when I got involved in debates and reading about the subject and talking to Mari and the APPG. But I've got more incensed as I've got involved in this, because I believe there has been a cover-up and there continues to be an attempt to cover up, and I think it's therefore the job of members of Parliament to blow the whistle along with others about that. And I have, in both my speeches and the most recent debates over the last 2 years, I've talked about that. In the most recent Westminster Hall debate on 23rd of April, I went so far as to say I think this is a national scandal. I think it brings shame on our country and indeed on and it's shame because we're talking about a drug. There's no medicinal or therapeutic value, was known to be suspected of causing congenital malformations, stillbirths and miscarriages, had many warnings of adverse effects, and yet there was no attempt by the regulatory bodies to either suspend the drug or take it off the market. One almost wonders what we were paying them for. And of course that drug was the pregnancy test called Primados. Now, Primados was unnecessary, it was invasive, and actually it was untested. And it was promoted at a time when there were non-invasive and safe methods of diagnosing pregnancy. You have to wonder what was motivating them, though I think we know. During my April comment speech, I referenced the scientific evidence by Professor Carl Hennigan and Dr. Aronson. That had been published, of course, and had been peer-reviewed at least twice. Strong evidence. And the meta-analysis by Professor Hennigan and Dr. Aronson found there was a clear association between HPTs and congenital abnormalities. Both Professor Hennigan and Dr. Aronson are acknowledged to be leading experts in evidence-based medicine. They have practical experience in the field of medicine. Professor Hennigan is still a practicing GP. You've heard from him. But of course, his meta-analysis was criticised by members of the EWG during an interview session with yourselves. The EWG had published a study in 2017 which had not been independently peer-reviewed. The EWG used the same data Professor Hennigan used in his meta-analysis, yet the group reached a different conclusion. Except, actually, they had two conclusions because they changed their minds. In the EWG report, it was stated there was no causal association. But what was not mentioned in the report was the fact that they agreed there was a possible association, a statement repeated many times by members of the group in the same oral interview session. Why was this change? Could it be that admitting there was a possible association could point to a balance of probability, a very important legal term in these types of cases? By admitting there was a possible association, past regulatory failures would need to have been reviewed. And if that review had been initiated, damning evidence, I believe, would have been revealed, which would have proven that the government health regulators failed in their duty of care. The regulators took no action to either suspend or take the drug off the market, as I've said, despite hundreds of warnings from both the medical profession and Shearing's own scientists. Now, as you know, the Commission on Human Medicines have been responsible for the recent critical ad hoc reviews on both the meta-analysis and Professor Vargason's zebrafish study. This commission was previously known as the Committee on Safety of Medicines, whose chair was Sir Derek Dunlop. I hope I'm not going too far, just to note that this same Sir Derek Dunlop advised doctors that they could destroy medical records if they were concerned about giving evidence relating to adverse effect. Quite an extraordinary statement. But I want to look at these recent reviews of the work of Professor Hennigan and Dr. Aronson, because remarkably, The cover-up that I've talked about over decades seems to be continuing. That means you've got a very difficult job because you're hearing different views from different experts. Now, I'm no scientist, but I'm trying to read this material and come to a view as an independent person. But I do think this cover-up is happening, and it goes to the heart of the problems that you're having to wrestle with. I just repeat that a failure to prove the science would stop the review of past regulatory failures. And I think there's a lot of people with motives to prevent that review of past regulatory failures. But your review has been mandated to look at past regulatory failures. And so for the EWG and others involved, it was essential for them to discredit Professor Hennigan's findings and his conclusion that there's a possible association. Indeed, since the 23rd of April, you know there's been 2 expert working group reviews of the Hennigan-Arison analysis, one by the Commission on Human Medicines and one from the European Medicines Agency. Given what I've seen throughout this saga, I was not surprised to learn that both reviews contradict the conclusions reached by Professor Hennigan and Dr. Arison. The question for you and for others is, was their review a credible scientific review? Now, I'm no scientist. I can only go by records that I can read and sometimes even understand. And it's difficult to assess the validity of the CHM review, partly because the recording of the discussions during the recent CHM review were destroyed immediately after the meeting, and only a paper copy of the minutes was produced. Unlike this hearing that you're putting on your website, everyone can see it's permanently there. Didn't appear to be the case in this recent EWG review. The minutes apparently do not reflect the full contents of the discussions. We know this because that information was revealed by attendees at the EWG meeting. I think this is astonishing that it's still happening, this lack of transparency of people who are trying to undermine scientific evidence by some very respected scientists. The 2 main experts selected by the CHMA were not epidemiologists, I've probably got that wrong. During discussions, they heavily criticised the Newcastle-Ottawa scale used in Professor Hennigan's meta-analysis, and they promoted an alternative methodology, Robbins 1. Now again, I'm not an expert, I'm not a scientist. Don't please ask me to explain these methodologies, I would fail miserably. I would just point out 2 layman's observations on them. The Newcastle-Ottawa scale, according to what I've read, is a well-proven and well-used methodology. Robbins 1 is a relatively new methodology, and it has been subject to some heavy criticism. What was interesting, I don't know if this has been revealed to you, but the 2 main experts that were selected by the CHM to criticise Professor Hennigan's work and criticise his methodology were leading designers of the Robbins 1 methodology. What's also astonishing is that Professor Stephen Evans, who confirmed he was the lead on the EWG review team, is one of the collaborators on Robbins 1. Now, this may be completely innocent. It's just interesting. And remembering this is Professor Evans who concluded there was no causal association in EWG report of 2017. Now, attendees of the CHM review of the meta-analysis were informed by the chair that the EWG report should not be referenced during the discussions of the review. They were told by the chair that the review of Professor Hennigan's work would be totally independent, with no input from anyone associated with the 2017 EWG. We've already identified that Professor Evans was associated with Robbins 1 and was the lead member of the EWG. But we've also discovered that an employee of the MHRA who made a highly critical presentation of the meta-analysis to the attendees prior to the presentation by Professor Hennigan and Dr. Arison has now been found to work closely with the scientist who was a core member of the 2017 EWG from 2009 to 2012. In response to concerns being expressed about the close association, we were informed that the MHRA presenter had not had contact with the scientist since November 2016. But remember, the EWG review commenced in 2015. I leave you to make your own conclusions. I think it's hard to believe that the CHM can claim that it's totally independent in this review when it's been tainted by prior knowledge and possible bias. I can't prove that, but in this type of world, all these associations, all these relationships, at least raise the eyebrow. And I wouldn't be making these, frankly, astonishing comments on work that's been carried out in this country in recent months if I didn't think there was a history of such problems going into the past, going all the way into the past. And what's most astonished me was some of the evidence that was found in the Berlin archives. I talked about this in my first speech back in, I think, December 2017, where you had the company's scientists being interviewed by lawyers to give them advice on what they should or shouldn't say and whether their claim would stand up in court if they ended up in court. And that those notes of those meetings, some of them in the late 50s and early 60s, are really clear that they knew at the time. And they were warned by their lawyers that if this had gone to court, they clearly hadn't gone through the right methodologies that were accepted as normal practice at the time. So this cover-up in this country, and it's across the industry, and a lot of the people related to it. And I have not heard a good defence from this collection of people. What we have heard is independent scientists like Professor Hennigan, like Dr. Aronson, who've come afresh, independently, and reviewed this material and had it peer reviewed and have found very differently from these EWG and other experts. Now, you asked Chair at the beginning of your remarks, what would we like to happen? Well, first of all, we'd like you to conclude what you believe the truth to be. It's not easy. You have a hard job given the different evidence you're hearing, but I hope that collectively we have sowed in your mind there must be some serious doubt about the way different people have acted and doubt about their motives. But that's looking at the history. What should happen going forward if you manage to get to the truth? First of all, the patients, the parents and the children, the adult children now who've been affected, I think deserve redress. Redress, I would say, in two ways: compensation, but also redress for the care they need and the extra support they need. They have waited far too long, as we will hear that some are no longer with us. And I think that should come from the government, ultimately, because I think there's been regulatory failure. I would also, this is my final point, want a review of the regulatory framework. I think it's found to be seriously lacking throughout this. And as a parliamentarian, someone interested in public policy, it clearly isn't the independent regulatory framework this country should have. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's extremely clear. And the background is enormously useful to us. Thank you very much. Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to come and conducting this review. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, Member of Parliament for North East Somerset, and I became involved in this because of a constituent coming to see me because his son had health problems which seemed to be linked to his mother taking Vide in pregnancy. And then I spoke to Yasmin about it and understood that this was a much wider problem. And I'm a member of Parliament. I'm not an expert in medical techniques or scientific procedures for testing drugs. And therefore, the role I have is to try and get answers for my constituents about the obvious questions. And the difficulty here is being in getting those answers as to why things happened as they did, why information that seemed to be known was not brought more widely to people's attention. So I think there are a number of issues here, which, as I said correctly, you're looking at. And the regulatory issue, there could be a regulatory failure, even if it turns out that you can't prove that the drug was dangerous, because the drug had another purpose, which we know about as an orsifasciin, which makes it a very strange thing for regulators to have approved as a test for pregnancy, because there is an obvious risk that it could be problematic if mistaken because of its alternative use. And even if you can't prove the abnormalities that many people think followed from using the drug, that seems to me a very clear regulatory failure in the first point. And the issue that I don't think has ever been addressed is the extent to which this drug's risks have never been properly tested before it was prescribed. That I know, from my business background, I once ran a fund investing in pharmaceutical companies, and that many drugs fail to get through because they simply fail on the poisons test. And that, was this ever done with Vide? Do the evidence that we now have in relation to mice, in relation to fish, and some in relation to rabbits and to rats, do they show that actually, if the tests that would now be done had been done then, that Primodos would never have been available for prescription as a pregnancy test? And without applying hindsight to say we should have known in the 1950s what we know now, wouldn't it not be reassuring to people who think that there is this link between abnormalities to show that the drug would indeed have failed if that is the case? Wouldn't it be right to research that rather than simply the discussions that we've had in relation to Henneken and the metadata and testing of metadata, which seems to me to raise as many questions as it answers, because if Professor Henneken because of the weakness of the underlying studies, then isn't it the case that those underlying studies can't be relied most unusual place for these things to be going on. I knew we were at Silverstone, but
Probably the bishop.
If the underlying studies didn't provide a base for Henneken, did they provide a base for the APPG to say that there wasn't a causal link, or were they overstating their conclusions on the evidence that they had in front of them? But I want to go back to some of the issues that came from this coming to see me, and the causal link question, because although everyone accepts thalidomide is responsible for abnormalities, as I understand it, the causal link has never been proved for thalidomide because of the ethics of doing the tests that you would require to prove the link. And therefore we're always dealing with a balance of probabilities and risks, and back to the ethical question of could it possibly ever be right to use, as Edward was saying, this test, which had no therapeutic benefit, to find out something that could be discovered in other ways, when it was also known to be an orsifasciin. And isn't that a sort of very early indication that it was unsuitable? And the early date of some of the studies, that first warning was in 1958. It's not that we're saying that we know now that there was a risk, but that people knew there was a risk really before this drug was even being properly marketed. And the first major study was in 1967. In 1973, Shearing was saying a teratogenic effect cannot be ruled out. Now, with a drug that has no therapeutic effect, if a teratogenic effect cannot be ruled out, surely there is a regulatory failure if that drug continues to be used for that purpose. And that in a way there's not a lot more to say beyond that. that once the drug company had that suspicion, even if the suspicion were wrong, it should only have been used for something that had a definite therapeutic benefit, not for a test, even if there weren't any other tests available. But as I understand it, there were other tests available anyway. So that, I think, is, in terms of regulatory failure, and reiterate my point, even if you can't make the link. The use as an emulsificant continues. The safety tests, there are only 2 tests to determine its safety prior to it being marketed in 1958, and these, as far as I'm aware, were never updated. So, of course, I understand that you don't go back and test aspirin once it's been established as being a safe drug, but actually, as tests got better post-1958 with a drug that 15 years later was being questioned, and in relation to the thalidomide problem that was happening at this time, surely to rely on 2 tests was insufficient, and the regulators ought to have been thinking about that. They ought to have been looking back to see if there was any history of safety. The issues that I've already referred to, and other tests being available, and the issue of informed consent, that shouldn't patients have been told that this drug was emulsificant, that many mothers, I would assume, would not have taken the risk of a pregnancy test that might have created an abortion. That's without Catholic, without coming on to the issues that Catholic mothers might have faced for ethical reasons that are almost certainly beyond the scope of this inquiry. But nonetheless, the issue of their informed consent, I would have thought is relevant, and they ought to have been warned. So, what is the sort of issue? What do we want? Well, we want answers for our constituents, and that's not to say what the answers ought to be, but it's to say that it is surely fair that constituents know why any 2 tests was deemed sufficient, why informed consent wasn't required, why an emulsificant was given out as a pregnancy test, why, in spite of concerns years before the drug was removed, did it carry on being used, what are the answers, and then what can be done to provide some reassurance that this won't happen again, that information will be made perhaps more freely available so that people know the risks of the drugs that they're taking. And as Edward was saying, that there will be some acknowledgement for the people who were affected, and some acknowledgement that something was done that was wrong, and that we can now look back and say was wrong, even if we're not absolutely certain that it caused any deformities or abnormalities, but that there were so many regulatory issues that nobody would behave in this way today, and slightly throwing the onus of proof onto the producers of the drug to make up for the regulatory failures, rather than saying it's the people in the families where there have been problems who have to prove the causal link, which is almost impossible to do. Anyway, thank you very much, and thank you particularly as great experts listening to an amateur, because I'm very conscious that I do not have the technical expertise in this area, but I do have a concerned constituent who needs to have a voice.
Well, thank you so much. And I think it's really very interesting to hear from the 3 of you how our parliamentary system does work in terms of democracy, and that your constituents have brought this to your attention, and that you are acting upon it. And I want to thank you for that. I think there are several themes that actually cross all three areas that we're examining. And Mr. Rees-Mogg, just the one on consent, that's come into all the three areas that we're looking at. But there are obviously some very important issues particular to hormone pregnancy testing. And we need to go away and really think about what you've told us and how we can really assess, obviously, what you've been saying, but to look at the value of what you've said and how we can think about it when we're writing our report. I mean, I would love to give you much firmer advice or firmer thoughts about what we're already thinking about. But we have been working really long and hard on this particular issue, particularly with patients, particularly with the patient group. And so at this moment, we're not in a position to actually say to you, we absolutely agree with that or we don't agree with that. But you have been very concise and very comprehensive as well. And I think that we will be looking at the transcripts. Now, I want to say about the transcripts that they will be produced before it goes out on the web, because we have to be very careful that whatever anybody says doesn't land either you or us in trouble. And I can't think that it has today, because you're very well versed in these things as politicians. But nevertheless, this is the system that we've adopted. So I don't know if my colleagues want to say anything, but we've got another group coming, an all-party group in about 10 minutes.
No, I'd just like to thank you. We've raised with a number of people who've been to see us, the general question is these are three things that have gone wrong. And the question I ask as a doctor is, why has it taken patient groups and politicians to draw it to the attention of the system and the profession? And that's a question that we ponder.
I do want to say.
Well, I'd like to echo Julia and Cyril's thanks to all three of you, and to Marion, Mike and Jason as well, for all the work that you've done, which has helped us, is helping us enormously. The only thing I would add to what's already been said is that the basis on which this review was established was the concerns of patients as channeled through parliamentarians and elsewhere. So we start from that perspective. In that sense, we start with an inbuilt concern, a focus. And I hope that would reassure patient groups and others with an interest in this.
And can I just say, on the question of the expert working group, we're thinking very deeply about that, and we will be thinking about what you have told us today. And also, we really have to be very sure about things like redress and compensation and other issues, Sir Edward, you've raised today. We cannot actually, we're not competent enough to study the compensation or to put forward. We can make recommendations, but we do not have the expertise to actually work through compensation, because it's very difficult. But redress is something that is really important, and you've all raised that in one way or another. And of course, the regulatory frameworks is something again that has crossed all three of the areas that we've been involved in. So we'll be thinking about that. So thank you so much for coming, and I'm sorry it's not longer, but we've got another group coming in now. So thank you.
Thank you.